A distinct honor to be giving this introduction for Zuma Mai Elliott. Mai Elliott is a highly influential and internationally recognized speaker, writer, and translator. She was born in Vietnam and grew up in Hanoi and in Saigon. She attended French schools in Vietnam and is a graduate of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. She is the author of The Sacred Willow, 4 Generations in the Life of a Vietnamese Family, published by Oxford University Press in 1999. Which is a personal and family memoir nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. The book vividly captures the realities of life in Vietnam across decades of historical change and turmoil. In it, she deftly explores complicated notions of identity as local life underwent generations of national transformation and modernization. The book explores the complex challenges facing Native officials under colonial rule as they pursued elusive goals of nation building. Her second book, published in 2010 and called Rand in Southeast Asia, A History of the Vietnam Era, chronicles the think tank's involvement in research about the Vietnam War at the behest of policymakers in Washington, D.C. The volume deals with Rand's research of insurgency and counterinsurgency in Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand during the conflict and assesses the effect that this research had on U.S. officials and policies. Regarding her family memoir, the New Yorker magazine stated that it is as engrossing as fine literary fiction and indispensable to understanding Vietnam from a Vietnamese perspective. In a 2016 podcast, author Malcolm Gladwell called her family memoir beautiful and her book about Rand brilliant, and recommended both on his podcast website. She has also served as consultant for filmmaker Ken Burns on the production of the 10-part documentary series called The Vietnam War, which aired on PBS in September of 2017. On a personal note, she is a source of inspiration for me and many others with Vietnamese heritage, whose family histories have been complicated by war. Her work and life story serve as a model for how one might come to terms with and understand complex past histories. For that, I offer her my deep appreciation. Some of you may remember that a year ago, she gave an insightful virtual lecture for the center, comparing events of 1975 Saigon and 2021 Kabul. We are now delighted to have her here in person on campus. Today, she'll be giving a talk entitled Looking for My Family's Roots in a Changed Vietnam. Please join me in giving Mai Elliott a warm welcome to our campus.
Thank you, Mel and Mary, for giving me this opportunity to talk to you all, and thank you for coming on a cold, blustery day. My talk today is about searching for my family's past in a changed Vietnam. And I've made a lot of changes. Like Leonardo da Vinci once said, work is never done. So I kept making changes. So I hope it's, on the whole, it still stays coherent. But first of all, I would say that in searching for vestiges of the past, time is your enemy. So are wars and revolution, modernization and globalization. They all bring profound changes, tangible and intangible, and they make the task of finding traces of history underneath all the layers of transformation a challenge. And this was the situation I faced when I returned to Vietnam to do research for my family memoir, The Sacred Willow. So I'd like to backtrack a little. I understand you all know the history of this region well, but bear with me if I repeat something you already know. So anyway, my family originated in the north. We moved to the south in 1954 to escape communism after the communists won control of the north down to the 17th parallel. And after they defeated the French colonial army at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and ended 80 years of French colonial control of Vietnam. Many of my relatives, however, stayed in the north, and I have not had any contact with them since 1954. Some I have not had contact with since 1946, when they left to join the fight against the French. During the war against the French, the resistance was located in the mountainous region or some kind of remote region. So once they left, and considering communication at the time, we lost contact with them. So in the South, many of my relatives had chosen to stay instead of joining the exodus of refugees when the war ended in 1975. or during the years following the end of the war. I had had very little contact with them then since 1975. As a Vietnamese American, any contact I had with them, either those in the North or in the South, would have brought communist scrutiny and maybe even retaliation against them and their families. So when I decided to write my family history, I had a huge information gap. I only had enough information to write half of my book from the stories and information I had collected from families on the non-communist side. But for those on the communist side, I had no idea what they had gone through. So I decided to go back, but I had to wait because the communists, after they took over the South, they established very strict control. And the economy hit bottom. The situation was very sad. And I knew I couldn't go back and talk to anybody under those conditions. So I waited until 1993. So the purpose of my going back to meet relatives in the North was I wanted to know what it had been like for them during the war against the French, during the Communist Revolution, which turned the North's social order upside down, and during the Vietnam War, when the North came under heavy American bombardment to stop it from sending troops and equipment, supplies to the South, and when the war efforts squeezed practically every resources from an impoverished economy and imposed harsh privations on its citizens. So in the South, I wanted to talk to my relatives about what it was like for them to live under communist control since the Vietnam War ended in 1975. So another purpose I had in mind was to collect photos and documents from relatives, and from relatives and also from the archive that the French had set up in Hanoi in order to supplement what I had obtained. Lastly, I wanted to go back to the places where my family had lived to rekindle memories. So things had changed drastically by the time I got back. Of course, the war in the South had ended. There was no peace, but the communists were in control, and they had turned the South into a socialist state like they had done in the North. But before I left California, I had no idea what would happen. After so many years, would I be able to find the places that form my family's history? Would I be able to find any traces of the society we once knew? Would I still be able to find any vestiges of the customs and traditions, especially the ancestor worship that had shaped our lives? Lastly, would my relatives be willing to talk to me after not having seen me for so long? So from 1954, when the communists took over Hanoi, they neglected it to focus the resources on developing the countryside. So there was very little development. The neglect continued after the Vietnam War started because resources had to be diverted to fighting the war. So during the Vietnam War, the United States bombed Hanoi. The most intensive bombing took place in 1972 when B-52 carpet bombed the city. However, the bombing targeted mainly targets that could support the war efforts, such as barracks, oil storage facilities, power plants, bridges, and rail yards. And although the bombing inflicted collateral damage, for example, during this carpet bombing, it destroyed a residential area in Hanoi. But on the whole, the bombing left the city intact. So when I arrived in Hanoi, I found it much as the French had left it when they deported in 1954, but the city was dilapidated from neglect. Hanoi had been a quiet town when my family lived there, and now it was even more quiet. The streets were deserted, and there was still very little commerce. The old quarters, once a busy commercial quarter, where my maternal grandmother had owned a silk store and where she had done a brisk business, were almost dead. But precisely because the city was not crowded and noisy, it had kept its quiet charm. Traffic consisted mostly of bicycles. The air was not polluted. Most buildings had been left as they had been, although some had been altered beyond recognition. Because Hanoi was almost frozen in time, I was able to locate the houses where my family used to live, and which were a big part of our memories. However, the transformation disoriented me. One villa had become the residence of the Foreign Affairs Minister of North Vietnam, who had taken part in the peace talk with the United States in Paris. So that's the villa back there. So the house that we owned had been seized by the government and was now state-owned. 9 families had been allowed to move in. Very little housing had been built by the communists, so residents were jammed together in whatever housing stock had existed under the French. So another city I visited was Haiphong. This was the port city of the north. My father had served as mayor of this port city under the French. Haiphong had been mined by the United States during the Vietnam War to stop Soviet supplies from reaching the north. Fortunately, the city was left intact because the United States did not want to destroy it out of concern that this would provoke the Soviet Union and especially Communist China into intervening directly into the war. So I had no trouble finding the mayor residence where my family had lived for many years. So this is a photo of my family in this residence. However, I found that this residence had been turned into the headquarters of the People's Committee. So, street view of that residence. It has changed so much that I had trouble pinpointing where my bedroom had been. And the residence was once our happy home, but now it's just offices, and it was lifeless and cold. So the visit to these former homes, although disconcerting, helped me validate our memories and add details of our life there for my book. So the communists have imposed strict population movement. People could not move freely, and this helped me find several cousins on my father's side and on my mother's side. I was shocked to find my relatives who had once enjoyed a comfortable life now living in near poverty. This cousin was allowed to stay in her home, but she had to share it with 7 families of strangers. And during the Vietnam War, she had to evacuate to the countryside, walking and bicycling to reach her destination. So my relatives' properties and other assets had been seized by the communists in order to destroy the upper classes and achieve social economic equality, and by putting the workers and the peasants, ones at the bottom of the social order, on top. So that the social order that had allowed my relatives and my family to rise in status and gain material comfort was gone. My relatives had been relegated almost to the bottom rung of the new society because they had been classified as offspring of bourgeois, intelligentsia, landlords, feudalists, and collaborators. They were not trusted. In some cases, they were discriminated against. But much to my surprise and relief, I found that the family bonds which was such a big part of my family story, was still strong. My cousins welcomed me back. Most importantly, they were willing to talk to me. So, this is my husband, my two cousins, and they pour out their hearts to me about what it had been for them during the French period, during the Communist Revolution, and during the Vietnam War. So, this cousin, his father was condemned as a landlord and persecuted. So, but talking about the war against the French and the Americans, they were very proud that they had fought off two superpowers, at least, two countries that were much more powerful than Vietnam. So I found that the spirit of nationalism, this defiance of foreign occupation, that animated them, had also animated this generations of my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and of my siblings. So my maternal grandmother, I had mentioned, used to own a silk store in Hanoi. So I went in search of something that could tie me back to her. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, this is another cousin I talked to. He had fought the French, and during the Vietnam War, he was assigned to Vinh Linh, near the 17th parallel, which was very heavily bombed. And he lived under a shelling bombardment for many years. He said every day he wished he could just have a minute of peace and quiet, because it would constantly bombard it. So I went in search of my grandmother's silk store. It's now been transformed, had a grill in it, and I had no idea what it had become. So the communists had seized all the assets, all the properties that my grandmother had worked to own and pass on to her descendants, but everything had been seized. So she had been buried in Hanoi, and, but sadly, the communists had forced the relatives to dig up her remains so that they could clear the cemetery to build something. And her remains were relocated somewhere outside of Hanoi, and I have no idea where it was. So I felt like she had disappeared without a trace. So one social custom that the communists had failed to destroy was reverence for ancestors. And once the control was lifted, this came back in force. So a cousin one day took me to visit my great-grandfather's residence and his tomb. So of the recent ancestors, my great-grandfather was the most revered because of his stature as a scholar, statesman. In the old days, people with scholars, intellectuals were highly regarded. At the height of the communist revolution, however, he had been condemned as a feudalist because he had worked for the last dynasty, imperial dynasty of Vietnam, when the French took over. So his residence had been destroyed. Only a wall and a raised platform remained. 20 peasant families, now the favored social class, had built houses over the land that had once been his house. So this is me going back and meeting the villagers who now lived on what was my great-grandfather's residence. But, you know, they were very happy to be able to have land. So, you know, something very good came out of that. So, another aspect of the old society, like I mentioned, was the worship of ancestor. So the next step was my cousin took me to visit my great-grandfather's tomb. So ancestral graves are very important in Vietnamese culture because Vietnamese believe that they maintain family connection, family continuity, but also they believe that the spirits of the grand ancestors could still influence the lives of the descendants. So the duty of the descendants is to keep the graves in good shape. But because my great-grandfather had been condemned as a feudalist, my relatives have been afraid to go back and keep his tomb in good shape. So when I visited, the tomb was in disrepair, overgrown with weeds. But because of the relaxation of control, my cousins have been able to undertake repairs. So the day I arrived, workers were starting to repair the tomb. So visiting my great-grandfather's residence and his tomb made me feel more connected to him. You know, he was somebody I had only seen in photographs. So now he became a little more real to me. So another aspect of the old society that had survived communist control was the useless of family connections. Through a relative, I gained quick access to the National Archive in Hanoi. Usually it takes 3 months, but I gained access right away. So this is the archive built by the French. That's outside. This is a building dating from colonial time, just as the French had left it. And inside I found catalogs, just as the French had left them. And I was able to get documents about my great-grandfather and my grandfather, who had worked for the French under the colonial government. And the documents were brittle. Nobody had maintained them. But from these documents, I was able to gain a more complete picture of their career. And again, I felt like I understood them better. So after that, I flew to Saigon, now called Ho Chi Minh City by the communists. So during the Vietnam War, it had been a place that was consumed with worries about the war and occasionally rocked by attacks, especially during the Tet Offensive of 1968, when the communists penetrated the city and attacked even the American embassy right in the middle of the city. But now, I found it at peace. So during the war, Saigon enjoyed a booming wartime economy, which was fed by the presence of 500,000 American soldiers and their spending, and also by the huge American aid. So that wartime economy ended with the departure of the Americans and then the end of the American aid. So when I arrived, Saigon was recovering somewhat, but was still in a kind of economic slumber because of the communist mismanagement of the economy after they took over the South, and also because of the American trade embargo, which was not lifted until February of 1994. So this was Saigon. A lot of shops were closed. If you go out there now, you'll find a different picture. But what was amazing to me was I found a lot of people yearning for the American period, which they call the Golden Age, precisely because the economy was so good, although despite the war. So in Saigon, as in the north, the communists had destroyed the upper classes, the old social order, and seized their properties to remake society, turning the South into a socialist country. So my brother's houses had been confiscated, taken over by cadres newly arrived from the north. The modest house that my parents had owned was now owned by one such cadre. So there's a little house there. So the house where we had spent our lives during the Vietnam War was gone. So, like I mentioned, the communists had remade Vietnamese society in the South like they had done in the North. So, as in the North, I found the reversal of roles very jarring. So, in the South, my relatives were from the losing side, the side that had fought against the communists with the Americans. So, whereas my relatives from the North, who had sided with the communists during the war, were now in charge. So while my relatives in the South were dispossessed because all their assets had been seized, my relatives from the North who were flocking to Saigon after the war were doing very well. Other relatives in the South had been incarcerated by the communists in what they call re-education camps. Like my oldest brother was held in a camp for 5 years. So I was able to find my two sisters, and I was very happy to be reunited with them at last. My oldest sister and her husband had left Hanoi let's just say Hanoi, in 1946 to fight the French. So like I mentioned earlier, once she left, we had practically no contact with her because she disappeared into the mountain region where the resistance was based. So I hadn't seen her for a long time. So in 1975, after the war ended, she, along with a lot of North Vietnamese, started to move south. So she was now living in Saigon. So from her husband, and their children, I collected many stories which gave me an insight into their lives during the 40 years when we had had no contact, during the 9 years of the war against the French, during the Communist Revolution, and during the Vietnam War, when they had to evacuate from Hanoi to avoid American bombardment. They too displayed the same spirit of defiance against what they perceived as French and American aggression that I had found among my relatives in Hanoi. My second sister had chosen to stay in Saigon in 1975 rather than fleeing as refugees to the United States. Although she was barely surviving the crumbling economy, she had weathered the communist takeover better than some other relatives because she had been classified as a worker, a desirable category in the new society, thanks to the clothes that she used to alter to earn extra income during the war. So she gave me, precious stories about life after the Vietnam War ended and the communist transformation of the society. And from her stories and the stories I collected from my other sister, I could now have write a complete history of my family. So the reunion with my sisters and their families was emotionally draining, but reassuring, because contrary to my fears, I was still able to renew my bonds with them after such a long absence. So I felt very thankful that these ties had withstood the test of time and war. So after that initial trip in 1993, I would return several more times. Each time, I was stunned by the rapid transformation of Vietnam as it became integrated into the global economy. The country had become a manufacturing hub, luring foreign companies looking for cheap but skilled labor, such as Nike and Intel, and lately Apple. So these foreign investments, along with the infusion of modern technology and the spread of American-style culture, had changed and were continuing to transform the country in ways I could not have imagined when the war ended in '75. So this is the Saigon skyline now, with a lot of high rises. This is Hanoi at night near the Central Lake. This is the shopping mall in Hanoi with stores like Cartier, Louis Vuitton. Oh, I better go back. So, but the widespread changes, though in many ways good for Vietnam, were making it harder for me to find vestiges of my family's past. Places that were part of our history continued to be altered. In Hanoi, one of our former homes, for example, had been turned into a museum. It's the Museum of Whoops. Whoops. How do I go back to? Somehow it went back to the beginning. Sorry. So one of our former homes is now a museum. It's a museum in Hanoi. It's a museum of the women of the revolution. But and society now has become a society of consumerism and acquisition. So the lifestyle has changed with the rising income. It had become more hectic and affluent, and it replaced the slow pace and very simple life that my family used to lead. But what was comforting to me was that underneath all these changes, our family bonds had remained unbroken. And many of the traditions, customs, and cultural practices that my family had known had endured. For example, my relatives still observe the tradition of going to visit their graves or ancestors once a year to push them up and pay respect. They still celebrate the Lunar New Year, Tet, but of course in different ways. So my repeated returns show me that time and events might have obliterated or transformed many tangible and intangible things. But enough traces were left to allow me to reconnect to and reconstruct my family's story. However, the pace of change made me wonder what would happen next. Will the continuing transformation erase all vestiges of my family? Will the customs and traditions that were part of my family's life endure? Will the family ties that were so important to us remain unbroken? I guess only time will tell. But my hope is that my relatives who return in the future would still be able to find the traces, physical, social, and cultural, that make up my family's story. Thank you.